Just find a good meditation posture, one that's comfortable and yet, again, maintaining this uprightness, this alertness. And then, as I've mentioned before, if you have a technique that you use with the breath, you can certainly do that. If not, one I find really helpful is tuning into the sensation at the tip of the nose, where you feel the air coming in and out of the nostrils. Making that your meditation object, just trying to stay present with it in a very gentle way, very relaxed way. Sometimes I compare our meditative focus on the breath to like holding an egg. So you don't hold an egg really tight or it will break, but you also don't hold it too loose to where it falls out of your hand and breaks on the floor. So you want to just maintain that nice balance between these two, not having the mind too tight, but also not being too loose. And just maintain your focus on the breath in this way. And whenever the mind wanders away from the breath, the job at that time is to recognize that. You can even label whatever it was that distracted you, but to let it go and to return to the breath. So I'll ring the bowl to begin this period of meditation. We'll just do a few minutes in silence, and then I'll lead you in a short reflection. So now, with our minds a bit more focused, I want to first invite you to begin to explore this topic of joy that we're going to be working with this weekend by recollecting some times in your life when you felt really joyful. And we're going to explore initially today what this word joy means. What is it we're really identifying as joy? But we all have our own experiences that we would call joy. And just recollect a few of those. Think about the circumstances, the conditions that led for you to have that experience. And then when you've analyzed that, go on to another one. No doubt each of us has many incidents in our lives where we experience that joy. And just spend a few minutes looking at those. And before we go on to set our motivation, maybe look at those experiences that you've brought to mind, that you've recalled, and see if there were any commonalities. Were there things that ran through each of those, some common elements that you could identify that were a part of creating that joy for you? And then in setting our motivation, to hold the thought of recognizing that joy is something that arises through causes and conditions. Have the intention to be here for today, for this weekend, with the motivation of trying to explore how to create those causes and conditions for yourself. To see that ideally it would be wonderful to live our lives from that place of joy, even in the midst of some of our difficulties, to be able to confront them with a joyful heart. And then after generating that motivation that is much more personal for ourselves, as usual we extend this to others. We think how wonderful it would be if also the time we spend here could be useful in helping us to become a source of greater joy and contentment to others. That everyone we meet, everyone we interact with, and that eventually all beings could be brought to deeper and deeper states of joy through our efforts here. And just hold that thought that we're not isolating ourselves in our own experience from the world, but rather wanting it to become a shared experience, wanting us to help others to know that true joy. And even funneling this into that mind of bodhicitta that is intent upon achieving one's own enlightenment to bring beings to that state of perfect joy, perfect bliss, Buddhahood. So this is never outside the context of that greater purpose that we are all trying to attain, that we are continually focusing upon to make all of our actions, all the time that we spend, particularly looking at the teachings, into the cause for that result, the enlightenment of ourselves and of all sentient beings. Okay, we're going to proceed as best we can without the PowerPoint for the moment. You don't have a television here, do you? Like a HD TV or anything? No. That we could do it? Okay. So I'll go ahead and proceed and talk about what's on some of my slides, and we'll see, if we're able to get some audio to go with all of this, because I think there's a lot of content that I want to share. As you know, this course that I'm calling the 8 Pillars of Joy, I'm totally indebted to the wonderful folks who put together the book that's called the Book of Joy. This is it without its wonderful dust jacket that has the pictures of His Holiness and Archbishop Desmond Tutu. I didn't really notice it had such a beautiful inside until I took the dust jacket off. But anyway, it's a really wonderful book that was published a few years ago. It covers 5 days that were spent in Dharamsala with His Holiness the Dalai Lama in conversation with Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Thupten Jinpa, who many of you know, who's quite involved at Stanford with the Cultivating Compassion training there, he was present because there were times when His Holiness needed to express something in Tibetan and needed Thupten Jinpa to translate, but he also took part in some of the conversations. And then the person who put the book together is a gentleman named Douglas Abrams. And so this is the source for what we're talking about. Over these 5 days of dialogue, they discussed a number of things pertaining to joy. I thought this would be a useful, dialogue for them to be engaged in, and then, of course, to be documented in this book. So essentially, there were 3 parts to the book. If you haven't read it, how many of you in the room have read the book?
I have it, but I haven't read it yet.
Okay. I have a lot of books I haven't read yet, too. It's amazing how many we can collect. And another person said it's amazing how many books we have that we've read the introduction to. You just kind of pick it up and you read the introduction, and then you go, oh, yeah, I really have to get to that someday. But it took me a little while to read the book as well, but I think it's really quite nice. There is a 4th part to the book that's kind of the after celebration and all of that, but that one's maybe not quite as relevant as the content we're going to talk about today. Essentially, there are 3 parts. The very first part was really talking about the nature of true joy, which is where I'm going to start today and explore a little bit of what they shared, because while we all brought to mind various experiences that we could say were joyful in nature, we see that there's a wide array of those, and it's important to kind of understand what are we really talking about here when we say the Book of Joy, creating this type of joy, the 8 Pillars of Joy. The second part I'm actually not going to teach on because I thought it was pretty self-explanatory, but it also is something that comes up in relation to the 8 Pillars. And that second section was called the obstacles to joy. What are the things that get in the way of our joy, that mess with our joy? That in California, you might say that harsh with my mellow, right? This is what Venerable Tenzin Choki says. This is a California thing, right? Don't harsh my mellow. So, we find that mellow, we find that little joyful place to be the things that become obstacles for us. Well, nonetheless, this is an important topic, but I don't think that, again, it's as relevant to what I really want to focus on today, which was in the 3rd section of the book, which was called the 8 Pillars of Joy. And as you know, you've got a little handout here that talks about these in brief. This is just a little guide to help you along the way, kind of a roadmap for what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to begin with talking about the nature of true joy. What does joy really look like? And then we'll go into each of these individually. My hope is, I've told a few of you this, but when I first taught this back in Santa Fe, I had a single Sunday for every one of these 8 And so it was nice to spend 2 hours on each of them. We had a little bit of a break in there, but obviously we don't have the time to do that here. But nonetheless, I think we can do justice to these. I think I even spent an extra Sunday, I know I did, on forgiveness. Forgiveness is a huge topic if you really let yourself get into it and understand all the intricacies of it. But we'll go ahead and try over these 4 sessions that we have, 8 hours roughly that we have together, to address each of these. So let's talk a little bit about true joy. What is joy? So in the book, there's a citing of Paul Ekman. Some of you may have heard of Paul Ekman as well. He's had many conversations with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. They've written a book together that's called something about emotions. I can't remember the name of it at the time. But he's done a lot of research into emotions. He's even renowned for having been the person who's mapped out the face and the facial changes that indicate particular emotions. So he's really good at reading faces. Venerable Tenzin Chökyi knows him and his wife, and she says that he'll like be with somebody, and he'll be like in his mind going, "Oh, a number 8, a number 22," like assessing what's going on with somebody's emotions on the basis of what their face is reflecting. We were talking about body language last night, right? And how body language, when we're in communication with somebody, tells us so much. Well, if you're cued into what's going on with faces, you can really tell a lot about the emotions that somebody's going through. Well, he's got a whole list of things that he feels are part of what we mean by joy. And we're going to start with the more mundane forms of joy, and then we're going to get into what I think is ideally what we want to be focused on this weekend, is not these sort of transitory experiences of joy, but something that's much deeper and more lasting, something that we can actually rely upon through all the various phases of our life and challenges of our life. So he says that he's written that joy is associated with feelings that are as varied as, first of all, pleasure, like the pleasure of the 5 senses. We have some experience that we could call joy that's there. Amusement, and he describes this as from a chuckle to a belly laugh. There's some joy that comes when we are in that place of being amused. Contentment, which is a calmer kind of satisfaction. Excitement, which is in response to novelty or change, when there's something new, the excitement of having something new in one's life, something different than what you normally experience. Sometimes this is like, when we go on vacation, we can have a lot of joy at the excitement of being in a new place and all the wonders that we see there. Relief can be a part of joy, where we have another emotion prior to that might be like fear, anxiety, and then we experience the relief. And there's a joyful part of that when we realize that emotion is gone. And so we have that experience. Wonder before something astonishing and admirable. Ecstasy or bliss, where we've sort of transported ourselves outside ourselves, where there's a feeling almost of being disembodied to some extent, but this more ecstatic feeling of joy. Exultation at having accomplished a difficult or daring task, when we've actually accomplished something, right? Or even in the joy of others' accomplishment, when a child graduates or those sorts of things. Radiant pride that we can have of another when they've done something very good, or we've accomplished something that's really admirable. Unhealthy jubilation even is included in this. There's the German term schadenfreude, where you take joy in someone else's misery. This isn't obviously what we're aiming for this weekend, but nonetheless, Paul Ekman includes it in there because we can have some joy that is not so well-founded, that is actually taking delight because we see somebody else, going through. Good, we're getting closer. So you can actually go to the slideshow, maybe that one. Well, good, wonderful. So go down a few slides. Let's see. And we'll be there. What is joy? Okay. Next one after that. One after that. Sorry. Okay. That was it. Unhealthy jubilation or schadenfreude. So elevation from having witnessed an act of kindness, generosity, or compassion. Sometimes we have that joy. We feel very elevated in the space of of seeing somebody do something wonderful. I've shared this story of this young guy a couple of times. There's a 4-year-old boy in Houston who was moved to start feeding the homeless in Houston. I mean, when you kind of watch a video of that, it was at CNN or something, and I saw this video, you feel a joy in your heart at watching somebody do this compassionate act, right? So it's a sort of shared joy in their what they are doing. Gratitude, we talked about gratitude the other night. Gratitude's going to come up again in the 8 pillars. But the appreciation of a selfless act of which one is the beneficiary is an example of gratitude. But there's many different types of gratitude. We can sometimes have, again, a joy that accompanies gratitude. So we can go to the next slide. And that's where we have the more elevated states of joy that are mentioned in the book. And for this, he went to Matthieu Ricard. So those were all the list of what Paul Ekman said. Matthieu Ricard, many of you know who Venerable Matthieu is. He's a monk in the Nyingma tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. Really amazing scholar and practitioner. He's one of the people who there's pictures of him with all the little nodes on his bald head where he was being tested for what was going on in his brain as he was meditating on compassion and that. So he's one of these pretty renowned practitioners in Buddhism. And he added 3 other more exalted states of joy. And this is really what we're targeting over this weekend. Rejoicing is where a lot of our Buddhist practice of joy begins, where we rejoice in someone else's happiness. By the way, all these slides I'm happy to send you a PDF of, so you don't have to copy everything down, all right? If you want to copy some particular points that you want to go back to, just at the end of this or whenever you are exiting from this, give me your email address and I'll be sure to send you a PDF file with all the slides in it. There's about 300 and some odd slides, so it's going to be a little bit of a chunky file. Hopefully I can send it to you. If not, I can maybe do a share somewhere through Google Docs or something, but so rejoicing, we know this practice very much, this idea of taking joy in others' happiness and their qualities. So it's the exact opposite of schadenfreude, right? Where you're taking joy in the misery of another. This, you're taking joy in someone's happiness. This is a healthy form of joy. And it's, again, a foundation of our Buddhist practice. It's what we even refer to when we talk about immeasurable joy, that practice of rejoicing in others, thinking of them in states of happiness and well-being and taking delight in that. The second one was described as delight or enchantment, and the description that they had in the book was a shining kind of contentment. Maybe it's kind of hard to put this in other words, but obviously this comes from a deeper level of practice. This comes from a deeper level of being in touch with joy in oneself, to where we're in a state of not quite continual contentment, but certainly a regular way of just being with life. I mean, sometimes we see this in children in a very innocent way, right? A sort of delight and contentment that's just going with whatever they're exploring. They're not really, maybe we see the opposite sometimes too. They're pretty miserable all the time. But this is something that we can achieve as adults, that we can find through a deeper level of practice. And that builds up into the third type of joy, which I like this term, spiritual radiance. And it's described as a serene joy born from deep well-being and benevolence. So this is really the aim of what we're trying to do. And as the next slide says, joy certainly does embrace all of these human experiences, but lasting joy. Joy is a way of being, that sort of serene, deep, radiant joy that you witness in the Archbishop and the Dalai Lama is probably the closest to those, the shining contentment or the spiritual radiance that are born from deep well-being and benevolence. So again, if you've ever watched videos of His Holiness or His Holiness with the Archbishop, you know that they have that kind of deeper joy that isn't going to be overcome that easily. It's going to be something that is stable, lasting, that goes beyond the transitory joy that we experience when we have delightful experiences. So we can go to the next slide, and this is citing, again in the book, they talked a little bit about this slogan that comes from the mind training teachings. The other night I shared the one of be grateful to everyone, right? There's another slogan from this text, Geshe Chikawa's 7-point mind training, that includes the admonition, always maintain a joyful mind. I like Pema Chodron, when she was writing about this, she said, one of her students said, always is an awful long time. But, if this is kind of one way that we're being admonished to practice, to always maintain a joyful mind, well, what is this joyful mind? How do we cultivate this joyful mind? Where does it come from? So we can go to the next slide. And Thupten Jinpa, as I mentioned earlier, His Holiness's translator, who actually wrote a translation and commentary on this revered text, explained that joy is our essential nature. This is kind of an interesting understanding that we have in Buddhism that maybe not be there necessarily in terms of other traditions, is to really recognize that the deeper nature that we all have within us, what we might call our Buddha nature, encompasses a lot of those qualities. That our sort of fundamental purity of the mind is totally resonant with this joy, compassion, well-being, all of that, because it's no longer plagued by any of the disturbing states of mind that block all of that. So we could say at some level that this is something that we all can realize through, in Buddhist terms, the process of removing all of those obscurations and getting deeper into our true nature, if you will, our sense of well-being that comes along with this revealing of our Buddha nature in that state. So, nonetheless, although we can say that this desire for happiness is an attempt to rediscover our original state of mind, as we're going to see in the next slide, we do have the ability to get in touch with that. So, although joy is our natural state, the ability to experience joy can also be cultivated as a skill. And this is true with any of these positive qualities. It's not that we just kind of wait for that moment when we reveal all of that and achieve Buddhahood that we experience any joy. Rather, we need to cultivate joy as a skill. Just like the way we cultivate compassion, we cultivate loving kindness, we cultivate all these positive qualities, because they are reflections of and getting us to that deeper state of well-being that we have. And I'm not trying to concretize that or make that into some sort of sense of self that we can rely upon. This is just the understanding that at the deepest nature, in terms of the purity of the mind, all of these qualities are resonant with that. Nonetheless, as it's pointed out here, we can cultivate it as a skill. That's why we are doing this weekend, is so we can begin to learn about the advice from these two great masters about how we can be more joyful in our lives. So, how do we cultivate such joy? What is the secret? So I found that cute little slide of the two of them. So what is the secret? Go to the next slide. This is the Archbishop speaking. He says, as we said right at the beginning, joy is a byproduct. This is what's kind of interesting. He says, if you set out and say, I want to be happy, I want to be joyful, clenching your teeth with determination, this is the quickest way of missing the bus. This isn't something we can force ourselves into. I'm going to be joyful. I'm going to be, happy. So if joy and happiness are byproducts, what exactly are they byproducts of? So this is, what they identified through the dialogue that they continued to engage in over these 5 days. They converged on what are called these 8 pillars of joy, as it's on your chart or your list there in front of you. 4 in the first box are the qualities of the mind. By that we don't mean, because in Buddhist terms, we frequently are equating the mind and the heart in terms of they're all part of our conscious landscape. They're all part of what we're working with. But this is maybe more like the head and the heart in a sense. So when we say mind here, we're meaning that these are more intellectual qualities that we can examine and begin to pursue. And then the other 4 of the heart. Now this isn't an absolute. If we look at something like humor obviously is a quality of the heart very much too. But it's a nice way of framing these two groups. The one thing I want to point out before we go too much further is to understand that these aren't from like a Buddhist sutra, right? There's no sutra of the 8 pillars or anything like that. These are observations from these 2 men who, again, most of us have some knowledge of their qualities and what they are able to discern from their own experience. So this is something they've put together that's not Buddhist in terms of you don't find this on the lists of the 8 this and the 5 that and the 4 this and all these other numbered lists that we have in Buddhism. These are something that they devised through their own experience. Nonetheless, many of these things that we see on the list we know are important in our Buddhist practice. So we're going to be looking at framing them in that context. Much of what they share is already adapted for Buddhist audience, so it's not like we have to translate a lot of things. But nonetheless, I'm going to try to encourage always going back to our Buddhist teachings so that we relate these 8 to what we're traditionally exploring. So in the next slide, we begin our exploration of perspective, which is the very first of these. So I didn't go through the whole list. I think it's okay. You've got them in front of you. You kind of know where we're going to be. For each of these, I tried to find a cartoon or some sort of graphic on the internet that would explain or give something to relate to that particular one. The first one of perspective is, maybe you've seen this cartoon before, where you have the man who's been stranded on the island and he's really excited, and his perspective is, oh, good, a boat, I can get off the island. And then the man who's been in the boat for who knows how long is looking at the same guy who's on the island and saying land, because he's very excited about the fact that he's going to be able to get out of the boat and onto land. Well, again, it's in your perspective. There's no absolute to this. Of course, perhaps in a few years, the man who's on the island will be very sorry that he got off the boat, and the man who's in the boat may be sorry he left the land. Who knows? But this is speaking to the power of perspective, that actually we can have a change in our perspective that can change the way that we're looking at things, that can make, what's the old saying? It's a horrible one, a silk purse out of a sow's ear or whatever. I don't know, these kinds of phrases that speak to the ability that we have to transform what we're experiencing into something very positive because we change our perspective. So we'll go to the next slide, which is the introduction in the book to this topic. It says the first concern. So you notice there's a huge jump in the pages. This is all the way back now into the individual 8 pillars. So we've skipped now to the third part of the book where we're looking at these 8 pillars individually. So the first concerned our perspective on life, which he described in the book as our ability to reframe our situation more positively. I actually use this word reframe frequently when I teach, because I think that most of Buddhism is really about this idea that we need to reframe what's going on so that we have a much different experience of what's going on. We're able to use what's going on in a very powerful way. So Douglas Abrams says a healthy perspective really is the foundation of joy and happiness, because the way we see the world is the way we experience the world. And they're very powerful stories, some of which I will be sharing as we go through this, that were in the book. And I mentioned The Choice, which is this wonderful book by Dr. Edith Eva Eggers, who was a Holocaust survivor, and her memoir of that and the things she shared. Many of you know of Viktor Frankl, who also was a Holocaust survivor who wrote Man's Search for Meaning. And we have these amazing stories, a couple of others that we'll touch on as well, of individuals who have been able, through the change in their perspective, transform what was the most miserable and awful and suffering, thing in the world for others into a very rich, powerful experience. This is the essence of frequently, we mentioned Lojong earlier, the mind training text. This is the essence of mind training, is changing our perspective, reframing things, so that when we encounter something that's difficult, we have a different perspective. We are able to welcome it in and use it. So a healthy perspective is very important. This is where we start. So changing the way we see the world, in turn, changes the way we feel and the way we act, which then changes the world itself. So even though this book is from both a Christian and a Buddhist tradition, this is a very Buddhist concept that we talked about the other night in terms of merit. Or, as the Buddha says in the Dhammapada, with our mind we create our own world. So this is the reality that our minds are the agent of creation of everything we experience, that this world is a creation of our karma. And it's not that each of us individually created this world. We all collectively created this world through the force of our karma to be reborn as human beings in this particular world. It's a bit of a far-reaching concept for some people to fully accept, but it's not denying that all the other causes and conditions happen to create this world. It was a really wonderful set of episodes in a show called One Strange Rock. I don't know if any of you saw this on National Geographic. I really liked it. Darren Aronofsky, the film director, directed these 9 episodes, I think there were. And it was based on the perspective that 8 astronauts had. This is actually something that's going to come up again in one of my slides shortly, but these 8 astronauts who spent some time up in the space station had a perspective of Earth that's very different than what we have, right? We're in our own little corner here with our own little climate and things going on, but they were able to watch what was going on from that vantage point. And each episode focuses on one aspect of this world, of this strange rock that we're on. And of course, everything that's involved in the causes and conditions that maintain and sustain life on this planet. And it's really quite eye-opening for me, at least. I mean, I'm not that big a science person, so maybe some of you who know a lot of this stuff might not find it quite as insightful, but very well put together. But, it doesn't, as I was getting in terms of my comment, this phrase, with our mind we create our own world, it's not denying all the complex causes and conditions that led to life on this planet. It's not saying that any of that didn't happen. Even though there weren't beings present that were involved in all of that when it first started, it doesn't mean that that's separate from, our karma, and it doesn't mean, again, as I said, that didn't happen at all. We're acknowledging that there are processes of cause and effect operative in the world. But those, in terms of how they are experienced by beings, is a product of the karma of those beings. So there's both things working together. The cause and effect that we see happening in the physical world that cause this world to evolve and develop into this habitable place. And then there's also the causes and conditions that allow sentient beings to be a part of that world, to experience that world. So this is a really fundamental principle in Buddhism that's important to acknowledge. For every event in life, His Holiness says, there are many different angles. When you look at the same event from a wider perspective, your sense of worry and anxiety reduces, and you have greater joy. So this is kind of the main shift that he's talking about, is this idea of a wider angle. We're very narrow in our perspective when you think about it. We like to think that we're open to a lot of different points of view and that we're able to take in a lot of information from a variety of sources. But nonetheless, we do tend to be very narrow in how we examine things. And the next slide is this woman I mentioned earlier, Dr. Edith Eva Eger, who often quotes her fellow Auschwitz survivor Viktor Frankl, who said that our perspective toward life is our final and ultimate freedom. And I found the quote from Viktor Frankl that I think she's referring to there. He said, "Everything can be taken from a man or woman but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way." And this was what he said actually helped him to make it through his time in Auschwitz and Nazi Germany, was his recognition that he had a choice still. This is why Dr. Edith Eva Eger's book is called The Choice, is because we do have a choice about how we are going to use the challenges that we face in our lives, the experiences that we go through. Talked about this a little bit in terms of, Donald Trump and his time in office, and that we have an amazing opportunity within the space of this to choose an attitude, a perspective that is going to help us to make the most out of this. We can continue to choose a perspective that allows us to be miserable in all of this. That's a choice. But this is the choice that we all have. This is our ultimate freedom, that no matter what anybody's doing on the outside, they can't take that away from you. And of course, we have many stories of imprisoned Tibetans in the Chinese prisons in occupied Tibet that have this similar concept, that they can choose to be in touch with their compassion rather than in touch with hatred and other negative emotions. So Thupten Jinpa said that while changing our emotions is quite hard, changing our perspective is actually relatively easy. I think that's a nice thought. I don't know that it's always easy. I think it's something we have to train in, but it is relatively easy when we consider it to some of the other difficulties we have in our Buddhist practice, for example. It is a part of our mind over which we have influence. Perspective, Thupten Jinpa argued, is nothing less than, he used the term skull key, but I think the more common way is the skeleton key, right? A skeleton key is one that opens up all the locks. So this is what opens up all the locks that imprison our happiness. This is why this is the first of these 8 pillars, is because if we change our perspective, a lot of the others sort of flow more naturally because we are looking at things differently. We're not as intent upon continuing to frame things in the way that have seen them as difficulties, suffering, what have you. Because this is going to be a lot of the main topic that we look at throughout this, is how do we deal with difficulties? How do we deal with problems? The easy stuff we also have to talk about, because it's nice when we do have pleasurable experiences and we can have a different perspective in relation to those too. But nonetheless, where we get really challenged is when things don't go the way we want them to, when we deal with difficult people in our lives, whether they be at a distance, in Washington, D.C., or whether they be right in our lives in terms of the people we work with or live with. So we can go on to the next slide, which essentially sets forth what we would call 3 described changes in perspective. This is by no means exhaustive either. We're going to have a chance at the end of this section on perspective to talk about other shifts that might be there. But yeah, Casey.
Before you go on, the idea of that you can just change your perspective, but if you have an emotion like when you're watching the news and you see all the degradations to our freedom, our civil rights, all the things that we are watching. So the instinctive thing that arises is this fear, this anxiety. I mean, that arises before your perspective can kick in. That arises. So my question is more related to, I can see the value in having a broader, wider, open perspective, but that reptilian brain reaction is
the fight or flight
so much
kind of thing.
Stronger. It's the one that rears up first.
Last Saturday, a week ago today, I was in San Francisco at Sechenling and did a day on working with fear. And of course, we talked about changing perspective as being how the initial way that we have to address fear. But I admit, and that was part of last week's teaching, was that there is a physical component to fear that is undeniable. That is that, fight or flight response. That is the adrenaline rushing, all the various things that go on physically. And I'm not denying that is a part of it. I think that that's an acknowledgement that fear is happening. It's like the warning signal. And what happens frequently is that people buy into a lot of the physiological changes and don't do a mental process around it. And it's not to say that changing your perspective is easy at that time. And that's where, again, this phrase that was just quoted from Thupten Jinpa, I'm not sure that that's always the case, that we can shift our perspective that easily. But it is, hopefully, our first way of working with fear is to acknowledge that we need to look at this differently, because if we continue to go to the places where fear seems to validate so many of our other negative emotions, then all we're going to do is buy into it at that level. There is a thought process underneath fear. They say that actually every one of our positive emotions as well as our negative emotions, our afflictive emotions, are actually thought processes if we get down to that level. It's just they become very instinctual. So like when we get angry at somebody does something it feels like the anger just comes up inside of us quite naturally and comes out of our mouth in terms of shouting at them or doing something to harm them. But that doesn't mean there isn't a thought process behind it. There is a thought process that we're so habitually inclined to that we're buying into it right away. The thought process is, here's something that is inherently evil and I'm going to do what I can to get it out of my life. We don't stop and think that, we don't go, oh, here's something that's really, unfavorable, and that's how I'm going to see it, is that it's totally unfavorable, there's nothing good about it, and I'm going to respond in this angry, way. We don't do that level of thought process. To change our perspective, we have to, though, because we're going to naturally buy into those, because the physiological response we cue into, and then the emotional response comes right after it. It's like in tandem. At least this is my assessment of this. It's interesting that fear, I mentioned this last Saturday on the workshop on fear that we did there, it isn't one of the traditional things that's talked about when we dissect the mind. There's this course called Lorik, where you look at one of the parts of it is looking at the mental factors, which are these 51 different things that in Buddhist studies they've identified as are little segments of our mind, little operative parts of our mind. And fear isn't even on the list. It's kind of outrageous in some way. And so that was part of what I explored initially with them, is where would you put fear? Where is fear coming from? Because if it's a deluded fear, And there is something we would call a wholesome fear, that is actually a warning we need to pay attention to and do something positive about. But if it's a deluded fear, fear that comes from that place of self-protection, of defending this sense of self that's distorted, then obviously it's rooted in delusion. It's a thought process too. But it's a very quick thought process. All of these, they get triggered quite easily. And we don't actually sit down and go, should I have fear or shouldn't I? No. We just have fear arising and the whole thought process takes over.
I suppose one of the underlying thoughts that could be part of that fear arising is the fear of change. I mean,
Sure.
Donald Trump is changing a lot of things that we've come to think of as solid and stable, and so it's that anicca thing that's rising, and we don't like that so much.
Absolutely. One of the quotes I used last Saturday, because we're getting off a little bit into fear, but I think it's absolutely relative to what we're talking about here in terms of perspective. Because if we talk about shifting our perspective, fear is one of the things we need to do that in response to. One of the quotes that I use is Pema Chodron in one of her teachings. I don't remember which one it was, but she says there was a Time magazine article where they did some research into fear. The whole article was about, or maybe not the entire issue, but the main article was about fear. They found that a larger percentage of people had fear of uncertainty than they had of their own physical suffering, like pain in the future. So even though they might think of, pain being something we have a strong fear or aversion towards, it's uncertainty that triggers it mostly, which is what you're talking about, the uncertainty of the times and of never knowing what's going to be tweeted next and what's going to be, this is what's driving people crazy at some level, is because the uncertainty is there. There was a relative certainty that was there, not that it's absolute, because we know this is a principle of Buddhism, that this is part of our suffering. This is actually one of them on the list of the 6 types of suffering, the fault of uncertainty. We have a world that we can't really count on. We like to think we can, and we really like it when we can count on it. When we go home and the person that's there is greeting us in the way that we like them to greet us, and we go to work and everything's, hunky-dory, and the ride there is fine, and everything's going well. We like to think that that's the way it should be. We don't like uncertainty. That's why 9/11 was so huge for this country. Because we went from a place of thinking there was relative stability and a lack of being invaded by, terrorist kind of mentality and acts, and suddenly that's a reality that we all have to face. I remember how freaked out people were. I'd actually left the country a few days after 9/11 because I was flying back to Italy. I think it was on the first day that they allowed flying again. And it was kind of nice in some ways to be exiting that, because you could see people's fear becoming so palpable. People didn't want to do this, didn't want to do that. I think some people were like really surprised I got on a plane on September 14th, and I said it's probably one of the safest times to fly. There just was this horrible event, and they're going to be like really screening and looking at people with, So, changing our perspective is a way of alleviating so many of these negative emotions, because then it causes us to have a different place to respond from. I like this word of respond versus react. These two that Viktor Frankl actually has a wonderful quote about, we need to allow ourselves the space to respond to something rather than react from that reptilian kind of emotion. Yeah, Bob.
Yeah, I have some question about the idea of looking at the question of changing perspective as something of choice. Because that sort of implies that when you're in a bad time, you have one perspective and you're aware of another perspective, and the question is, which perspective do you choose?
Right.
At least in my experience, there isn't another perspective out there. It's not like, I know of one.
Right.
I'm in a certain difficult situation with I can probably recognize it. Bad perspective, it's a bad situation. I'm clueless in many cases how to get out of the bad situation or out of the bad perspective. So the real challenge is not to make a choice, but to figure out another perspective, and so that you could make a choice.
I understand.
And that first step is a hard step. It's not like there's one that's self-evident. I guess in a handful of cases there might be, but at least in my experience, in most cases, it isn't a self-evident layout, and so
Right.
I don't feel like I'm confronting a choice. I feel like I'm confronting a dilemma.
Yeah, I understand. I guess that's part of why any of these spiritual traditions exist, I would think. I mean, I look at my mom, for example, who's very devout Catholic in her own way. I wouldn't say she's, at the top of the list. She's not Mother Teresa, but she's really, trying to abide by that philosophy and that way of looking at things. And so one way that she dealt with, for example, when my father was quite ill and she had to be involved in his care, and then, of course, his eventual death and that, she had this idea that she's gotten from her religious training. That's, the good Lord only gives you what you can deal with, kind of. It allowed her the space to have the perspective to think that she wasn't going to be overwhelmed by her suffering and completely consumed by it, but feeling like this was what God had meted out for her to deal with, and it was appropriate for her to deal with it. I mean, that's a very small way of looking at perspective that actually can be really helpful. Or another one that she frequently cites is, this too shall pass, which is a perspective that's taught in a lot of the Judeo-Christian traditions, but it's very Buddhist too, understanding that things are impermanent. So we have to have kind of an introduction, I would say, from somewhere else. I don't think it's natural for us to feel like we have a choice. In fact, even in Buddhist terms, we frequently say that people, individuals, sentient beings, are under the control of their karma and delusions, meaning that there isn't much choice. That people who are so firmly habituated by their karma into particular ways of acting just continue to act that way. They don't think, oh, should I continue to be that way or should I choose something else? They're not even, as you said, aware of something else, aware of a different way of being. I would say to some degree all of our spiritual traditions are about giving another perspective, a perspective that from the foundation of that particular tradition, from the teachings of Jesus or the teachings of Buddha or the teachings of whoever, that those are the messages that people will then try to live their lives by, that they will go to that perspective at times of difficulty or times of challenge. So yes, I agree. I think we have to be introduced to that idea. But even if we are introduced to that idea, even as Buddhist practitioners who've learned some of these things, we frequently don't feel in the moment that there's a choice because we don't have the recollection, the mindfulness of another way of being, another way of acting, another way of framing the situation. So it's all a bit of a challenge. It is an uphill battle. I sometimes compare our Buddhist path to, we're on a river, we all know, and it's a pretty fast-flowing river, so we're in this boat on the river. We first have to get the boat to go the other direction. They frequently use this term, against the stream. We have to go against the stream of what we tend to do. But the biggest challenge is eventually we have to get the water flowing in another direction. That's a whole other challenge. And I'm not trying to discourage you by saying these kinds of things. It's deep work because we've created the stream. We've created the river. We created the way that we are doing it. And it's not like we intentionally created it. It's not like we sat down and said, oh, I think I'm going to develop a lot of anger in my mind. We've had the seeds of all these delusions in our minds, and they've been continually nurtured through an angry state of mind, through following anger, through following jealousy, through following pride, through following greed, through following all of these states of mind. So we've got a huge force that we have to overcome, and it's difficult sometimes to introduce a different perspective that will be effective, and then also to follow that perspective in the face of something that wants to take you in the same direction. I don't have an answer to all of it other than practice. Practice, practice, practice. How do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice. Anyway, I don't know does that help somewhat, Bob? Okay, good. So let's look at these three. We'll go into each of them individually. I'll just go ahead and go through the three, and then we can introduce them as we go through. The first one is having a larger or wider perspective. And this involves, they say, and this is from the book directly, stepping back within our own mind to look at the bigger picture and to move beyond our limited self-awareness and self-interest. Again, something that's not easy to do, but we tend to be very myopic and, just looking at things in terms of me and how it affects me and the small picture of my little world, and not looking at the bigger picture of the world at large. And if we think about, for example, what's led to many of the problems we have in this world, particularly around climate change and so on, it's because people have not been so aware of the bigger picture, not been so aware. And we live in a time, I mentioned this the other day, that we live in a time where actually there's so much more access to the bigger picture, to what things look like. We have the ability to understand the effects of our actions. So there's an ability with this one to really transcend our ordinary narrow view, to look at things in a much wider perspective. Go on to the next slide. With a wider perspective, the book says, we can see our situation and all those involved in a larger context and from a more neutral position. By seeing the many conditions and circumstances that have led to this event, we can recognize that our limited perspective is not the truth. Well, again, we could say our small little corner of the truth is but one facet of it, that there's a greater truth that we hold to when we see the myriad causes and conditions that are involved in creating what we are dealing with. As the Dalai Lama said, we can even see our own role in any conflict or misunderstanding or anything that's happening in this world, that we can see the role that we are playing in that. But nonetheless, transcending, getting up above and seeing sort of the big picture does help us to understand that it's a lot more complex. I think in our culture we have a real strong tendency to think we can say, there's the cause, and think there's one thing behind anything. This happened around the gun violence issue to some degree. And admittedly, there are many different things involved in that. It's not like, we can just say it's this. There needs to be more attention to mental health care and mental illness. There needs to be attention to the gun culture, and the preponderance of assault weapons and all this stuff that are going on in our culture. I mean, you can say that there are many different things involved, or even school safety, which is where a lot of people tended to focus and say, well, aren't there ways that we can make our schools safer in terms of not prohibiting to some degree the entrance of people like this into the schools, through various, security and what have you. You can say that there's all these things involved, but to try to pinpoint one and say, if we fix that, then it's all over. We know that that's not the case. We know that situations in our world are much more complex than that. So if we have just our own little narrow perspective that is triggered by our own view of it, it's not going to be the whole truth. I mean, again, I don't necessarily like this phrase, it's not the truth at all. I think there's some component to the truth that we're frequently cued into ourselves from our own perspective, but it's not the whole picture. Go to the next slide, and we know this wonderful analogy that we all probably encountered sometime in our childhood years. This actually comes from a Buddhist sutra. I don't know if that's the original source of it, but it is in one of the Pali Canon sutras of the 6 blind men. In this case, it could be women as well, but anyway, in this case, it's men who are all touching a part of an elephant and describing the whole elephant on the basis of the part that they touched. That an elephant must be like a fan or a spear or a wall or a rope or whatever. So we know that this is what's going on in our world frequently too, is that people kind of having their own little narrow perspective that thinks that they've identified what the whole thing is, what it is in totality, but they're only knowing their own little corner of it. They can't speak to the bigger picture because they don't have that perspective. So we can then go on to the second of these ideas, and then we'll do a little more discussion once we kind of conclude looking at these different perspectives. This is an interesting one. A long-term perspective was mentioned. And by the way, this is my categorization of what they said. This isn't like we said, first we're going to talk about this, and then we're going to talk about that. But this was an important one that was brought up. This means to not be solely focused on the short-term and immediate experience, but to see how in times things can change in many ways, even for the better. Now, this is something I always am reminding people of in this turbulent time that we're living in, is that we have to have a long-term perspective. You can't lose sight of, right now, it feels like we're, in the boiling water. It feels like it's not very comfortable to be in the space of where things are at. Of course, it doesn't even feel like boiling water, but I think we need a temporary, assessment of what's going on. It's not like we're in Syria, right, in the midst of all this bombs going off left and right and people being annihilated. So if we look at things from this perspective of time, we always see that there is some change over time. Once more, things are impermanent. So by stepping back, we can also see the long view and have a clearer understanding of our actions and our problems in the larger frame of our life. This allows us to see that even though our situation may seem challenging now, from the vantage point of a month, a year, a decade, these challenges will seem much more manageable. There's an experiment in the next slide that Thupten Jinpa says. He calls it a silver lining thought experiment, and he says, take something bad that happened in the past and then consider all the good that came out of it. And each of us no doubt has that. I mean, maybe some bad things that happened in our lives, what we label as bad, had mostly detrimental impact on our lives. But frequently there's some silver lining to it. There's something that if we took advantage of that opportunity, of that challenging situation, we actually grew from that. We developed other interests on the basis of that. And this is actually one of the things that's on your little list of kind of some practices to work with perspective, is to actually do some reflection on that, to see if there were things in your own life that from the vantage point of now, you can see as actually having been somewhat positive. We're not denying the negative experience that you went through at that time. For example, if in my own case, where I lost someone very dear to me in 1992, and it was like the doorway to me finding Buddhism. I didn't have a spiritual practice at the time, and by virtue of that loss and turning to Sogyo Rinpoche's wonderful book, The Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, I had this immediate answer to all of my questions and what I would call a major silver lining to what was a very traumatic experience for me in terms of the grief I went through this happened when I was 34. So I'm not saying that everybody has that experience. Don't think we can make that an absolute, that everything negative that happens has a silver lining to it that is experienced. But we can frequently see how if we change our perspective and think about the long term, that actually some of what's happening to us right now in this moment that we find challenging could be really beneficial. Right? We can look at what we're going through as a nation, as a world, in confronting a lot of the problems that are happening, and we can see it as, it's just horrible, miserable, awful. Or we can say, wow, this is a real opportunity to grow, to develop greater connection with others, to develop deeper concern for the well-being of others in this planet. Again, it depends on our perspective. Are we looking at what's happening in the moment and being stuck in that and think, oh, this is all that matters, it's uncomfortable now? Or are we actually looking at the long term? Look at athletes who do incredible work, that is just phenomenal. Somebody told me about this thing called the Ironman races or whatever, that are like, I would never even think of doing such a thing. Sorry, call me a weakling, however many pound weakling. I won't tell you how many pounds. But these guys go through unbelievable training to do this. I guess women probably do it too. I don't know. It's called Iron Man. It should be called Iron Person or something. But I would never think of doing such a thing, but we know people are capable of enduring in the moment unbelievable strain, physically, mentally, to be challenged in that way for some result that they want to see in the long term. This is what so much of our Buddhist practice is about, right? That we really need to endure the difficulties of engaging in practice day in and day out, of trying to work with our minds, because we have some confidence that there is a result down the road that we will be able to experience that will be worth all of that effort. Otherwise, I don't think there's any point in us signing up if we don't have some idea that there's something we're headed towards that will be of greater benefit and greater well-being. So His Holiness mentions this frequently. We need to think long-term. We can't get so caught up in the moment. Venerable Urbina one time said, it's not like the person who says, I tried meditation once, it didn't work for me. Well, it's like you have to have more endurance. You have to have an ability to stick with things. You have to have an ability to, go through some of the physical pain and mental pain of doing this deeper work. One time of doing something and you're kind of assessing, that wasn't really what I wanted. I did one prostration, I'm never going to do another one again in my life or something. All this kind of short-term stuff, forget it. This is a good thing to go through when you go on retreat with Lama Zopa if you've never done that. His retreats can be fairly grueling, but you keep the long-term perspective. You think, why am I getting up at 5 a.m. to go into the Gompa and do prostrations and recite Lama Chopa and staying up until 11 at night, 11:30 at night to You do it because you know that the goal is worth it. You know that there's some long-term benefit. The last of the three perspectives that were discussed in the book, it's kind of related to the first one, the wider perspective, but here we're really talking about kind of getting outside of our own skin to be able to identify with others. This is a bit of what, Faya last night? Faiza, that's right, thank you. Faiza last night said, is that, when we're able to actually be with somebody who's empathic, who's actually understanding it from the point of view of our experience, not just being solely in their own little world, their own little bubble. So this means that we shift from an individualistic point of view, where only our own needs are considered, to a more collective one in which the needs of others are taken into account. Now, we're not completely out of the equation here. And go to the next slide where we actually have some citing from the text. It says, this wider perspective also leads us beyond our own self-regard. Self-centeredness is most of our default perspective. And admittedly, that's so for every one of us, right? We tend to live from that place of thinking it's all about me and what I need during my day for my well-being, my happiness, my this, my that. But as the Dalai Lama and the Archbishop demonstrate so powerfully, we also have the ability to take on the perspectives of others, to be empathic with others, to really care about their needs and their concerns. So the next slide then is this thing I mentioned about the astronauts. I think it was in a Pema Chodron tape that I was listening to, an audio recording, where she talked about this insight that many of these individuals who spent time up in outer space kind of came to this conclusion. And this is from this Sultan bin Salman al Saud, who was up at the space station. He said, the first day or so, we all pointed to our countries. So you kind of still have that tendency to look from the point of view of yourself and what's going on. The third or fourth day, we were pointing to our continents. But by the fifth day, we were aware of only one Earth. That when you see Earth from that vantage point, that you don't see all the boundaries any longer when you start to pull back to that perspective, that you kind of see the shared experience that we are all looking at here. So anyway, I think that's kind of indicative of what we're talking about in this moving away from self-centeredness, from what is it like for me in my own little part of the world, in my country, and my suffering, to what is it like at the larger scale with others involved, with their needs being considered. That's why if there's going to be any shift in terms of what's going on with climate change, it's going to take individuals making that choice that they're going to do this not just for themselves, but do it for the larger, greater good, for the greater good of all the beings on this planet, because it's not just human beings that are being impacted by climate change. In fact, it's probably animal life that's being impacted in a greater degree at this stage by virtue of what we're doing. So this is an important part of our perspective. A little bit more on this. As the Dalai Lama and the Archbishop explained, this wider perspective leads to serenity and equanimity. It does not mean we don't have the strength to confront a problem, but we can confront it with creativity and compassion rather than rigidity and reactivity. So this is the thing, is that, there is a space for this compassionate connection to others in having this different perspective. Yes, we do have more serenity and equanimity, but we do have the strength then and the vantage point to look at confronting problems, particularly these big problems that we do have going on in this world. Can maybe begin to develop a deeper resource within ourselves and in the world to confront some of these issues. So I'm curious if there's other shifts in perspective that you've utilized to your benefit or that you've been aware of in your life. Anyone? Yeah, Rosemary.
I actually find the reframing pretty simple, but one of the techniques that I've been using a lot, like if I'm upset about something or anxious about something, and my tendency is just chew it over and over and over again.
Right.
But I've noticed through, and I think meditation and being aware of what's going on has helped a lot with this.
Right.
Is sometimes I can just decide I'm going to put this on the back burner. I'm going to go to work, and when I come home from work, I'm going to look at it again. And just taking that break and giving it a little space and a little time. Sometimes I get home and I go, it wasn't so important after all anyway. So that's a technique that has really worked.
Good. That's a good one. And again, that we can see that taking it, like you said, sort of putting it on the back burner, I mean, taking it out of our immediate focus and allowing it to sit frequently does allow for other things to, that we can call upon, our own inner wisdom that we can cultivate. I think going back to what Bob says, that's one of the problems sometimes, is that we're confronted with something and we feel the need to react immediately or respond immediately. We don't have the space to go, okay, I can set this aside. And sometimes things call for us to attend to them immediately. We simply don't have that opportunity to say, sorry, I want to put this aside for the moment and I'll get back to you in 8 hours or something. Good, but that's a good one. I think that's an important one. What was it that our parents always told us when we were getting angry or something, to count to 10, Even just counting to 10 is a useful way to sort of say, okay, I'm just going to sit with this and say, is it really worth my getting upset and angry and whatever? So, other shifts in perspective that, yeah, Casey.
Yeah, talking about the anger, I started doing this. I can do it with the things that are likely to cause me to be angry and ruminate on the anger, and that the bigger anger things, but like the little irritations, I still get lost. I get swept away by those. But the bigger ones, I notice I'm able to catch myself easier. And what I've been doing is I stop and I think, is it really worth it to lose all the merit I've created by getting angry over this one thing and creating the negative karma or reinforcing the imprint by just losing it over this one thing that, in 2 hours or maybe 2 days, it's not going to even matter.
Right.
Yes, I look at it from that really long perspective of lifetimes of the work I've put in. And I'm like, do I really want to? Yeah. So, but the little irritations, that one I still forget. With the drivers on the road, or but then I still lose it quicker. I'm not so mindful in those ones.
Yeah, maybe the threat doesn't seem quite as large, so we don't have the impetus to curtail it. But I think this points to what Casey's saying, the idea that our Buddhist teachings can help us to reframe things if we have that understanding. I would say, again, a lot of what we have in Buddhism, going back to what I mentioned in response to Bob's question, a lot of these spiritual traditions, they offer ways of reframing things so that we have a deeper ability to look at things and be more patient, be more tolerant, be able to use things in a more constructive way. The understanding of karma, the understanding of the nature of existence as dukkha, as suffering. This is a big perspective that I think we can have, that we don't expect everything to go the way we want it to, because we have that understanding that this is part of existence. These are shifts in perspective that come through the Buddhist teachings that I think are really important. I think another one that I've seen really useful is to understand, as I was mentioning earlier, with Buddha nature, that essentially sentient beings are good. I mean, there is a good core to beings. I think in our culture we have so much of an identification as like people are kind of rotten at the core rather than really beautiful and wonderful, and that they have that kind of good stuff within them. I mean, there was one story that really inspired me. I share this frequently. A Buddhist teacher. He's in the Against the Stream organization that Noah Levine started. Kind of an interesting guy. I didn't really meet him, but he was at a teacher conference I was at, and then I heard his story, and I was like really taken by it. His name is Vinny Ferraro, and Vinny was and where is it, in Connecticut? I don't think it's New Haven. I think it's, what's the other big? Hartford, perhaps. Anyway, maybe New Haven. I don't remember, but there's gangs in these. I mean, you don't think. I don't know. When I think of Connecticut, I've never been. I don't think of it like as being a haven for gangs. But apparently, he hung out with a gang and would beat up homeless people, and they'd like take baseball bats out and do all this. And there was, his story is that one night they were out getting ready to do all this, horrible stuff, and they see this homeless man, and he's there with his bat raised, ready to start beating on this man. And the man looked up at him and locked eyes with him and said, "Please don't do this to me." And Vinny said to the guy, "What makes you think I'm not going to do this to you?" And he says, "Because you have the most compassionate eyes I've ever seen." And that, like, is practically dropping the baseball bat. He heard this thing that, like, totally unlocked this soft spot, like I mentioned the other night, this place where he was able to be in touch with a more humane way of being. That's at the core of us. It's not the hatred and the awful stuff that's there that we're just going to continue to reside in. It's the hatred and the cruelty is what armors that to such a strong degree. That's why people can do some of these really horrible, horrific things to other individuals in this world, or even to animals in this world. It's because they're blocked to feeling that. But it doesn't mean they don't have it. It just means, the crack is kind of there. You need to expand that and make sure that the light all gets in. So that really restored my confidence that we're fundamentally good. I don't believe in, this idea that we're sort of all kind of rotten, we're all evil, left to our own devices, we'll be kind of at our worst rather than at our best. And you do see many times people rising to the challenge when things are difficult and really being their best. I mean, some of these stories that have come out about school teachers that have stood in the face of the bullets coming into the classroom or things like that, really courageous and selfless acts that speak to a deeper goodness within all of us. Anyway, that's my little preaching on that for a bit. That's another shift in perspective. And I think it also leads to a shift in perspective to be fundamentally optimistic versus pessimistic. I think this is a huge shift in perspective that we need in our culture. To think that even in the midst of all this happening, that fundamentally it's going to be okay. I mean, it's not to say that it's going to be Superman swooping down and saving the day. I mean, we have to do the work to make sure it gets to that. But we have to hold a much more optimistic view in general, to think that there's good in what we're trying to accomplish, good in every effort we make, even if we can't solve the problem completely. We're certainly at the place where with climate change, it's unlikely we're going to be able to go back to all that. Maybe have to have human annihilation before all that happens. But the point is that we still make the efforts with some optimistic mind, with some, this is what Joanna Macy calls active hope, having that strong hope that is not just ungrounded and believing somebody else is going to do it, but an active hope that thinks positively, even if the result isn't achieved. That's much more beneficial. As Venerable Rabina says, even if you're drowning, why be pessimistic, Be optimistic. Even if you're drowning, why not be optimistic? I mean, at some level it's true, right? If you're sitting there and you're drowning, okay, I'm drowning, but at least I'm going to have a cheerful mind, kind of think that, look at the bright side. Always look at the bright side of life, Any other ones that people want to share? I think this is an important topic. We're spending a little more time on it, but I think it is important because it's where we start. Yeah, Bob?
I think there's really two pieces to the reframing. One is reframing while something difficult is happening.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other is, assuming you manage to get through the difficult time, reframing how you think about it and live with it.
Yeah.
And those are separate, at least in my mind.
I think so.
Now, I'm not sure I figured out much in terms of part one. Part two, what I have often tried to do is I guess this reframing, is try and figure out what I can do so that whatever it was doesn't happen again.
Right.
And, change to the extent it's in my control. Usually, to some extent, it is.
Mm-hmm.
How you can change your way of doing things so
Sure.
that it's unlikely that you'll be in the same situation again.
I think that's a wonderful way to use that post-event, introspection, is to really see, what could I have done differently? What would have changed my own mind, perhaps, in the midst of it, or even the outcome of it, or whatever? What did I learn from it? I think those are really important observations to do. I frequently encourage that people at the end of their day, of course, in this tradition, we emphasize a lot of, purification, making sure we tidy up our messes. That's an important part of our practice. But I also encourage, as part of that reflection, to really not just say, oh, I'm going to purify it, take care of it, clean it up, but to investigate that and say, okay, I did use some pretty harsh speech with that person. How could I have looked at it differently? What sorts of Because in the moment, like you said, we may not have the ability to make a choice or change or reframe, but we can make the decision afterwards to look at how we would do it differently. What sorts of thoughts would be better to introduce at that time? What sorts of things we want to recall and remember the next time we encounter that? Then at least we've got some effort behind it that if we do encounter it again, perhaps we'll be a little bit better at recalling that. Over time, I guarantee we will, if we actually keep bringing it to mind, keep investigating it. Don't allow it to be just, a past experience that we can just move away from, but actually reframe it after the fact. So I encourage that to be part of everyone's practice when you do your purification, is not to say, I need to clean this mess up, but how do I make sure I don't get into that mess again? How do I make sure that these volatile emotions are addressed to some degree and don't continue to, take over my life? That's how we really do the learning. Otherwise, it's just hit or miss. We'll just keep doing the same thing again. Maybe sometimes we'll be a little better, but we're not really doing anything to move us in that direction. So, if I go back to some of the stories, like Dr. Edith Eva Eggers, there was obviously in her story, which is an amazing book, she talks about how she dealt with it at the time, and her thinking was, if I survive today, I'll be free tomorrow. That was the thought that got her through many days of being in the concentration camp. Now, it wasn't a thought that led to disillusion the next day when she wasn't free, because this did happen to many people. In the concentration camps, they would hear rumors, they said, of they're going to free us all from the concentration camp on Christmas Day or something, and then they would wait for Christmas Day with such anticipation. Christmas Day came and they were still imprisoned Christmas Day the day after, and they would die sometimes just by virtue of that thought that held so tightly to needing to be free on that particular day. Her thought was more like, if I keep holding that every day, then I will continue to survive. I will continue to not give in to the despair and the fear and everything else that was around her. And many similar stories from those who did survive, that they made this choice in the moment to do something. But then there's a whole process afterwards, and that's where the book becomes, I think in my mind, even more emotional, is her ability to reframe that situation from the perspective of having lived through it. It was one thing to get through it day by day, but you still have the trauma of all of that. You still have something that you experience that needs to be processed. So I agree with you. There's two different points of examination, and the first one can be very hard. I agree. That's where we do need some of the Buddhist skills that we work on in this tradition, the mindfulness, the presence, the awareness, to be able to be in the moment and make a different choice. We'll get there. I trust that we'll get there. Yeah. Any other shifts in perspective? Yeah, Rosemary.
One night when Venerable Yongchen was leading the meditation on Wednesday night, she introduced a very simple Tonglen exercise, which was basically kind of identifying how you were feeling within yourself, but then thinking about all the other people who might be feeling the same way at that moment, and then doing Tonglen on that basis. And that is almost like an instantaneous shift for me to be able to do that.
Wonderful. And that's a part of that shift of, getting outside of ourselves to acknowledge all the others who are suffering at that time from the same thing. And, I tried this with my father. My father was quite ill towards the end of his life, and I even led like a little Tonglen meditation with him. I offered it, and eventually my mother convinced him to go along with it. But it was interesting. I'll share this. It's it kind of indicated to some degree my father being, with his perspective, that was unable to really go there. So I led the little meditation. Maybe I wasn't very skillful in leading the meditation either. I'm not saying I was, perfect in terms of what I did, but I led the meditation, and I thought, tried to help him to see that, what he was experiencing, he wasn't alone in his suffering, that he could open his heart to others in their suffering, and that. And at the end of it, my father says, well, it was an interesting meditation, but I don't know why I'm doing that. And I said, well, knowing that he was Catholic and had this strong, feeling for Christ, I said, don't you want to be as compassionate as Christ? Don't you want to have the same compassion that Christ has for all beings in their suffering? And he said, that's impossible. I can't do that. And I think, again, I attribute it to, from my own understanding of being brought up Catholic, that one of the tenets of Christianity is that Christ is the Godhead. Christ is this being that is up above, and we're at our lowly little human level. And there's no way that we can ever completely embody. We can have Christ consciousness in a sense and develop Christ-like qualities, but they're Christ-like. They're not Christ. They're not the same as Christ's compassion. And so there is a real gap between what we can accomplish as a human being versus what these divine beings have. And of course, Buddhism doesn't follow that perspective, right? Buddhism says that a Buddha who is, yes, in a state superior to us, isn't something that we can't attain. It isn't something that we can't practice having that level of compassion. But his perspective disallowed him from thinking that was even a possibility. Of course, he never asked for the meditation again. That was fine. I was happy to have shared it that one time, and it's okay, Tried to give him some other way of working with his suffering, and maybe he found his own way through his own faith. But different faiths do have different perspectives on this, and Tonglen's an amazing practice to help us to get out of our feeling of the isolation of our own suffering and really identify with others. And there's validity to it because, again, in the state of Buddhahood, that's what you are about. You are totally immersed in compassion for all beings and the compassion that wants to free them from suffering. These are great. Let's move on to wrap this up a little bit. These are the concluding thoughts on perspective from the book. When we take the perspective of others, we can empathize with them. One starts to see the interdependence that envelops us all, which reveals that how we treat others is ultimately how we treat ourselves. This is kind of from that perspective of acknowledging that others are involved in this. We're not standing alone. No person is an island. We're all involved in an intricate web of interdependence. And so how we treat others is how we treat ourselves. And karmically, this is so, right? We are also able to recognize that we do not control all aspects of any situation. This leads to a greater sense of humility, humor, and acceptance, which are the next three qualities that we're going to look at. Recognizing that it is quite complex. It's impossible to control the entire thing. Even if we do our best from our vantage point, there are many other factors involved. So once more, although I mentioned maintaining an optimistic point of view is very important in terms of our perspective, it doesn't mean that we are convinced and absolutely hold to the necessity of having that result. We still recognize that the result that we're aiming for is beyond our control. In terms of the world at large, it's conditioned. It's going to have its own factors, its own causes and conditions arising. So I think that concludes perspective. I think the next slide is where we go to the practice suggestions, which are on your sheet. So you don't necessarily need to, again, write any of this down. Thupten Jinpa's experiment that we mentioned earlier, the silver lining experiment, to see if you can, look back on something that you considered to be a really negative event in your life and see all of the things that may not even be aware of all the things until you stop and contemplate that came out of that were actually quite positive, quite useful. I mean, many people have come to Buddhism out of that, like my story of, when in some deep suffering or grief, to turn to a spiritual path as a way of finding answers, being able to resolve some of that. And then the second one is just a suggestion that when a difficulty arises, choose one or more of the shifts in perspectives to try out, taking note of what happens internally when you do this. Because this is, once more, the topic of this weekend. These are the 8 pillars of joy. Does this produce more joy? More of this, again, that we talked about earlier, being kind of a deep sense of inner radiance or well-being that we're going to be able to rely upon, because that shift in perspective is going to allow us not to get overwhelmed by the emotion of that time, to go to that place of anger, frustration, what have you. So it's just some suggestions. I think that's important as part of this. Sometimes the suggestions do come out of part of the book is a number of these exercises, but Thupten Jinpa's was part of the text that I just thought would be useful for people to do, because we don't frequently do that, look back on times of our lives that were challenging in that way. Let's go on to the next one, unless there's any other comments on perspective. Okay. Humility. Well, I found a cute little cartoon for humility, which is actually, I think they said this. I found this being attributed to C.S. Lewis. This humility isn't thinking less of yourself; it's thinking of yourself less. And the cartoon has the man that's like got all these little thoughts, like, no one likes me, I'm not worthy, everyone's better than me. It's like putting oneself down in the process of humility, self-denigration, which we're going to talk about as part of this topic. In our culture, sometimes this is what we think it means to be humble, is to like think that you're the dirt under everyone's shoes or something. No, this isn't what it means. It's thinking of yourself less, to actually think, oh, there's people around that I need to pay attention to. This is a bit of, again, out of that perspective, that shift in perspective that we mentioned, where we get out of this self-centeredness and begin to acknowledge that there's other people around us. So we're going to have a few things that we cite in this that will help us to explore this. So the Dalai Lama and the Archbishop were both insistent that humility is essential to any possibility of joy. When we have a wider perspective, what we just talked about, we have a natural understanding of our place in the great sweep of all that was, is, and will be. And we kind of come to that bigger picture view and, again, acknowledge that it's not all about us. This isn't, the dawn show every day. This is, the world at large in a much bigger picture. This naturally leads to humility and the recognition that as human beings, we can't solve everything or control all aspects of our lives. We need others. So this is out of that change in perspective that we can see that humility is an essential part of that. So it's important to spend a little bit of time examining what we mean by this humility. So the Archbishop has poignantly said that our vulnerabilities, our frailties, and our limitations are a reminder that we need one another. The fact that we have those places where we can be wounded or where we can feel somewhat, that things are not right, those are indicative that we need others, that we can't do it completely on our own. We're not created for independence or self-sufficiently, but for interdependence and mutual support. That's why, again, this might be a side topic, but this is one reason why I really am convinced that Buddhist centers and Buddhist communities, what they frequently call a sangha, it's not technically what we mean by the sangha jewel or anything, but a sangha, a community of support, is so important for our spiritual practice. We have a feeling, and this is very much a part of American culture, of the kind of Lone Ranger mentality, like we're going to do it all on our own, and some sort of strange pride that thinks that there's nobody else involved in our successes. I mean, he who shall not be named is, an example of that, right? Who tends to attribute an awful lot of his success to himself and not very much to the contributions of others to what he has accomplished in his life. But we need others. This is why a lot of his actions have been so unnerving, is because even the people that he needs, he's been quite difficult with. So we are not created for this autonomous, independent existence. In fact, as we know in the deeper Buddhist teachings around emptiness, no such thing exists. Everything is dependent upon other factors. Everything is arising out of dependence, not out of independence. You cannot have anything independently existing in this world. So we need that kind of mutual support in a conventional sense that understands that how we accomplish things is actually through many people being involved. Even just any moment of welfare we experience is due to many beings in the background. It's kind of all those people that I mentioned in the analogy of the theater that are kind of sitting in the dark of the theater that we don't really acknowledge so easily, that we're not grateful for so easily. So the Dalai Lama was saying that we are all born and we all die in the same way. And at these moments, we are totally dependent on others, whether we are a Dalai Lama or a beggar, whether we are an archbishop or a refugee. There's, what do they call it? They say death is the great equalizer. This is one phrase that we have in our culture. Birth is too. I mean, many of these times when we are most vulnerable, when we really do depend upon others for some care, some ability to help us in the times of our, illness, dying, being born, and so on, or even as a young infant. These are times that our vulnerability is quite clear. But nonetheless, it doesn't mean that everything in between we're not dependent upon others. There's just times when we are more dependent upon others, but we're always dependent upon others. With the keen insight of a longtime friend and collaborator, Daniel Goleman, who many of you have heard of, he's wrote a book on emotional intelligence. He characterized the Dalai Lama's attitude toward life. The Dalai Lama seems amused by everything that is going on around him, taking pleasure in whatever is going on, but not taking anything too personally and not worrying or taking offense at anything that is happening. He's got a real genuine sense of humility, of just kind of not thinking again that it has to be a particular way for him. And we frequently see the Dalai Lama when he goes to these, teachings and stuff. He's in a limousine, and I'm sure he's like being flown first class and all this, but it doesn't mean that the Dalai Lama has this pride that goes with some of this superior ways of being treated and handled or whatever. I think His Holiness is really quite humble in the midst of all this. He always starts most lectures he starts with what? I'm just a simple Buddhist monk. I mean, very humble in terms of thinking, again, I'll offer what I have to offer, but don't think this is like some word from on high or something. This is just him sharing who he is with others. So the Dalai Lama was reminding us throughout the week not to get caught up in roles. And indeed, arrogance is the confusion between our temporary roles and our fundamental identity. This gets into, and I'm not going to go down the whole rabbit hole of talking about emptiness and selflessness, but we are only in temporary roles. Every one of us, kind of a role that we've created through the force of our karma and delusions, and sometimes our good qualities as well. But we've created all this stuff that we experience, that we cling to so tightly as our identity, and then all of that identity goes away in a moment when we die, right? All of what we did, of course, in terms of our karma, goes with us. But the fundamental identity that we have is over. It's over and done with. Don will be just this person of the past. There won't be any Don that kind of goes forward in that regard. Oh, and by the way, I'll just mention, what's your name? That just came in. Kim, that's right. Yes, Kim. I can make the slides available if you want after. You can just let me know your email address. So I noticed you typing things, and you can certainly take notes, but I'm happy to supply the PDF of the slides if you want them, afterwards. So we don't really, what is our fundamental identity? This is kind of we can't say that there's sort of an identity that's inherently there at the core of all of this, because we know that that's not true either. So it's a little tricky, the language of this. But we are all in temporary roles. This lifetime playing this particular role, another lifetime playing another role, another lifetime playing another role. There's no fixedness to any of that identity. Who you are that we cling to so tightly isn't really who we are at our deepest essence. Now, what we might mean by a fundamental identity is that pure consciousness, that Buddha nature that can be revealed in its full radiance upon attaining enlightenment. And there's no real kind of character to that in a sense. It's just pure wisdom, pure love, pure compassion, it's all those wonderful qualities, that joy that we talked about, that's sort of innate within that. All of those sort of manifesting, there's no identity around that in a sense. I mean, a Buddha doesn't think of themselves as a particular person. They're just that raw, full experience of consciousness, manifesting in a variety of forms through the force of their compassion in the way that we manifest in individual forms on the basis of our karma and delusions. So we can't get caught up in too much of this. I mean, our humility should be very much about just peeling back a lot of that and being able to be okay with whatever role we're playing. There's a wonderful story that His Holiness shared in relation to a verse that we're going to look at shortly from the mind training verses. And these were teachings in London I had the good fortune to attend in 1999, where he cited a story. He attributed it to Patrul Rinpoche, who was a great master in the Nyingma tradition, this great Lama. And he said Patrul Rinpoche would frequently get kind of tired of being in the limelight, of being the teacher that everybody was coming to, and he would just sort of disappear for days. And he'd go out wandering as a nomad, and with no identity as being a Rinpoche. And how he would spend his evenings is he would find a place to stay where he could do menial tasks in order to stay there. They'd give him a little room to sleep in or something. And so his followers needed him for something, his disciples, and they came after, kind of followed the trail where he must have gone, and they show up at the place where he's staying, and they ask the family there, is Patrul Rinpoche here? And they say, oh, there's no Rinpoche here, And then they begin to describe, what Patrul Rinpoche looks like, and suddenly, to the horror of the person who's like, it's the mother of the family, she realizes that Patrul Rinpoche has been staying there, and at the time he was like emptying her chamber pot. He was like doing this really menial task. And she's like, oh my gosh, I've had a Rinpoche doing these things. But from Patrul Rinpoche's point of view, it didn't matter. I mean, he didn't care whether he was cleaning up somebody's waste or teaching on a throne. No attachment to that role. He's just going to do whatever he needed to do to be with others and to, they're putting him up for the night. He's happy to do these things. Again, we get quite attached to our roles and identities. So aspects of humility that are discussed in the book is, what is it like to embody genuine humility? Because we can see that, as I mentioned the other night, I'm a big fan of fake it till you make it, but we have to admit that there are ways that our humility might look a little forced, and we can start there, but we can move towards having it be more genuine. And then the second one, seeing its relationship to joy. This is something that was talked about in the book, and I think it is important to discuss a little bit, because sometimes with humility, we don't think it's very joyful to be in that state. It's kind of like, what's so joyful about thinking I'm, the lowest of all, or, kind of putting myself down. Again, that's where it's getting distorted, but we have to be careful about that and make sure that we see that there's actually some joy that can be generated in the space of letting all of that go, letting all that attachment to who I am and my role and what have you. And then it is important to also know the opposite of it, pride or arrogance. That is the enemy of humility, and humility is the antidote to those. And then the last point that I mentioned that is worth talking about a little bit is our tendency to fall into self-denigration when we practice humility, and we have to avoid that, because that's not what we mean by a real humble state of mind. So there's a Tibetan prayer, the Dalai Lama said, which is part of the mind training teachings. A Tibetan master says, this is him paraphrasing Longri Tangpa's second verse of the 8 verses, "Whenever I see someone, may I never feel superior. From the depths of my heart, may I be able to really appreciate the other person in front of me." This is actually a very gentle and kind way that this is being paraphrased. The next slide has the way that it's normally translated. I think this is Lama Zopa's translation. "When in the company of others, I shall always consider myself the lowest of all, and from the depths of my heart hold others dear and supreme." That phrase, the lowest of all, is like, subject to a lot of misinterpretation, unfortunately. Because as that cartoon that I introduced this topic with, it doesn't mean that we're lower than everyone else, that we think less of ourselves. It means that we think more of others. And that's the sentiment of the last part of this, right? From the depths of my heart, to hold others as supreme, to hold them as dear, to not be constantly obsessed with myself and what I need, but to consider the needs of others as so much greater. This is what a real genuine humility looks like. Tough to practice, right? I mean, this is not easy. We have a tendency to, because of, they frequently talk about the twin demons, the two states of mind that are operative. The one that this is initially targeting is that self-centeredness, that self-cherishing, that tendency to think it matters most what my experience is. It's not so much what everyone else is going through, it's me and what I need. That's sort of pride we take in ourselves, and we follow after that. And we tend to that self much more than we do others. In fact, we even neglect the needs of others on the basis of that. And then the other demon, the twin demon that this is indirectly referring to, is the self-grasping that's underneath there. That, as I mentioned, is that tightness around an identity, thinking that there's some sort of fundamental self that's here, that is real, and that is our true identity, when in fact it isn't. So on the basis of holding that self, this pride arises, and the mind of self-cherishing arises in tandem with that, kind of holds oneself very dear. And so this antidote of saying humility is a sense of acknowledging that my greatest purpose is really to serve the needs of others, and that I will actually be fulfilled in serving the needs of others. Let's go to the next slide that I think begins to get into this a little bit. The word humility, this is maybe a little bit of a side topic from what I was just talking about, but it actually comes from the Latin word for earth or soil. I don't know how you pronounce it. Humus. It's not humus. It's not the the stuff you eat that's made out of garbanzo beans and all of that. Humility literally brings us back down to earth, sometimes with a thud. It's kind of like bringing you down to earth, bringing you back to that place where it's not like, again, earth is below everything. Earth is on the same level as everything. Earth is kind of acknowledging our sort of groundedness, our commonality. So, let's skip over these. Go skip that slide. Oh, let's go ahead. Go back. Sorry. Back, I'm sorry. Rather than, before we go on to this topic, though, there's this idea again that we need to make sure that, and we're going to touch on this a little bit with the self-denigration thing, to make sure that we really understand what this humility means. It's sort of, as I said, bringing us down to earth, bringing us kind of taking away from that elevated place that pride is all about, and really being sure that that doesn't interrupt and interfere with how we relate to others, that we begin to see the preciousness of other beings. I think I have a slide on this idea later, but this is why I was anticipating that the slide was going to be next, was this idea that His Holiness has introduced in many times when he's teaching, that this is how to be wisely selfish. You've all heard this before. His Holiness saying that when we are able to diminish the sense of self-importance and embrace the welfare of others, to cherish them, that is how we are actually able to achieve our greatest happiness. Sometimes it doesn't feel like it in the moment. Sometimes it feels like a bit of self-martyrdom or something. But if we actually follow it through, we can see karmically this is the case. If I think of others and am generous with my resources, that actually is the way that I have resources in my life, karmically. If I treat others with respect and kindness, that is how I in turn get treated by others. So the way that we actually achieve our welfare is by being concerned about others, by being wisely selfish, by attending to others in a way that actually produces the results that we want. I mean, the Buddha's whole set of teachings, the whole corpus of everything that he taught is revolving around the issue that fundamentally each of us want to be happy and we don't want to suffer. But we don't know how to go about doing that. We're really misguided. We're following erroneous ways of accomplishing that. His Holiness, in saying that we need to be wisely selfish, is pointing to the actual way to accomplish that. If we really want this self to be happy, to be free from suffering, we have to attend to others. We have to cherish others. We have to hold them dear in this way that humility is speaking to. So, on to this topic of humility being involved in cultivating joy. This is the second of the topics we're going to touch on around humility. Douglas Abrams, back to that slide. Douglas Abrams asks, can you explain the role that humility plays in cultivating joy? This is him asking the Archbishop, and the Archbishop started laughing. And I'm going to share with you what he is laughing about, because he went on to tell a story of a bishop who exhibited false modesty. And then there's another joke that Douglas Abrams shares. This is page 206. I just thought it was really too cute to not share, but hopefully you'll enjoy it. So this is in response to that question, can you explain the role that humility plays in cultivating joy? And the Archbishop, just laughing, he says, they tell the story of a bishop who was about to ordain candidates to the priesthood. They were speaking about virtues, including the virtue of humility. One of the candidates came up to the bishop and said, "My lord, I've been looking in the library to find a book on humility." And the bishop said, "Oh yes, I've written the best book on the subject." We see kind of the power of humility as it relates to joy by virtue of, the way that people don't have it, the sort of false modesty in a sense. And then Douglas Abrams says that he thought he might also share the joke that he often tells of the three bishops, This is him looking at the archbishop, and he thought for sure that the archbishop was going to tell this joke. And this is the joke the archbishop sometimes says. He says, these 3 religious leaders were standing before the altar, beating their breasts with great humility, saying how before God they were nothing, nothing. Shortly, one of the lowly acolytes in the church approached and started to beat his chest, professing that he too was nothing. When the 3 bishops heard him, one elbowed the other and said, "Look who thinks he's nothing." I love that one. So this was our Archbishop's, way of kind of talking about this subject. Let's go to the next slide. Because this is what Douglas Abrams said about this. He says, these stories about false modesty are funny because humility is not something that one can claim to have. It's kind of interesting. Can you claim to be the humblest person on the planet? It's a self-defeating thing, right? You can't say that because that would deny your humility. So it's for this reason that I think that the Archbishop was laughing about the question even before I had finished asking it. Next slide. Nonetheless, he and the Dalai Lama were saying that humility is essential to a life of joy, and it's exactly this humility that allows these 2 men to be so approachable, so connected to others, and so effective in their work in the world. So, I don't know if he really answers the question about what is its relationship to cultivating joy, but I think he points to the fact that when you have it in a genuine way, you obviously live in a much more joyful place. I mean, if we do think about people who are very prideful, it's kind of like, the kings and great rulers that, are dreading the fall, right? They're living from a place of strong advantage and of thinking that the world is going to continue to revolve around them. And they get very conscious of the threats that others pose to them. They say this is actually the fault of the desire realm gods, right? The desire realm gods have this great pride. The demigods have this jealousy that is always looking to them and wanting to get what the gods have. So when you're the god, with that pride comes the fear of losing all of that, the fear of not having all of that, of others taking it away. And so if we're humble in all of this, then there's a space for joy because we don't have that worry, we don't have that concern. If we show up and we're allotted the task of doing something that's quite menial, we happily do it. We don't have this fear of thinking that somehow our being relegated to that place reflects on us personally or has any damage to who we are. We're just happy to be there, happy to be taking part. So I think that this is, speaking to the role that joy plays, or that humility plays in cultivating joy, that when we're in that space, we can be a lot lighter. We don't have to be so heavily concerned about things. All right. Yeah. Casey.
This is just reminding me of something I saw on the news the other day, and how much our suffering can be caught up in this need for some recognition or acceptance or whatever, and it's the lack of humility that is actually creating the suffering. Donald Trump was at a rally the other day, and I don't know where, Minnesota or somewhere, and he was talking about they, referring to who knows who these they are, maybe the media.
Yeah.
They refer to others as the elite. And he was like, why don't they call me the elite? And his reason for this just intense suffering was, I have the best apartments. I am so clever. I'm so smart compared to everyone else. I have more money than all of them. Basically, I should be the elite, but nobody recognizes how elite I am.
Poor Donald.
Such visible suffering.
Exactly.
Such visible suffering.
Yeah, from feeling
So you laugh, but you feel so bad for him.
Exactly.
Because it's just...
He's plagued by that, yeah. I mean, on the campaign trail, how many times did he say, nobody's better than me at this? Nobody, I know all the best people. I know, there's inflated sense of who he is that is kind of the next thing that we go to, is making sure that we understand pride, not just so we can identify it in others. That's not so useful. And maybe we can have more compassion for them in the space of their pride because we see how painful it is to be in that, but to really identify it in ourselves. So yeah, like you said, it's really painful to see people who are that attached to needing to be the center of it, needing to be the elite, needing to be whatever. Oh, poor Donald. By the way, my name is Donald, but please don't call me. I've never gone by Donald. That's something my father would say when I was in trouble, right? Donald. He actually uses my middle name too. Donald James. Get in here. Anyway. Let's go to the next slide on knowing pride or arrogance. So none of us are immune to the all too human traits of pride or ego, but true arrogance really comes from insecurity. This is what we were just touching on, right? That there's this underwriting insecurity that's there. Needing to feel that we are bigger than others comes from a nagging fear that we are smaller. It's kind of interesting. This book was written before all of this, but seems incredibly applicable now, right? And this should break our hearts, that people like this, especially somebody who can be in such a strong position of power, has this as their undercurrent, right? Of feeling this incredible insecurity and insufficiency, this sense of, I'm so much smaller, I need to inflate all of this so that I feel so much bigger. Let's go to the next one. I just thought I would share with you, in the traditional teachings in Lorik, the teaching where we kind of pick apart the mind, there are 7 types of pride. I'm not going to go through all 7, but I think it's important to understand even the first 3 that talk about how pride can be much more distorted depending upon who it is that we're observing. This first one is just what we normally think of as pride, where we have a puffing up of the mind, thinking that one is superior to lower persons. Now, again, this is fairly subjective, but nonetheless, we can maybe say that somebody who has more wealth than other people, and they know that they have more because of the jobs that they have or the neighborhood they live in or whatever, where we look at somebody and we feel prideful in relation to those who have less than us in terms of knowledge, in terms of resources or whatever. There's excessive pride, where it's a puffing up of the mind thinking that you're superior to equal persons. This is where the people who are in the same neighborhood as you feel that you're better than, even though you know you're at the same level in terms of your own wealth or status. Pride beyond pride is a puffing up of the mind thinking that you're greatly superior even to people who are superior to yourself. The people who are in the neighborhood that's up on the hill, that's up above yours, that's much greater than yours. That's, So this is where we can see our pride can get incredibly distorted, where we're totally out of touch with things, thinking that we're even better than people who are better than us or who have greater qualities than us. So pride can become really pervasive in our lives if it's not kind of nipped in the bud, and can cause a great distortion. We're going to just wrap up. Actually, let's just stop here. It's a little afternoon, and I don't want to go into the lunch break too much. When we resume this afternoon, we'll go into the last topic on humility, which is to make sure that we don't kind of divert into self-denigration, kind of suddenly beat ourselves up in the process of this humility, that is a real distortion of humility. And we'll talk a little bit about the practice suggestions, that sort of thing, and then we'll go on to the next pillar, the pillar of humor, which we won't talk about a whole lot, but it's important to talk about that and even laugh a little bit. I love how, if we're at a Dharma teaching and we don't laugh a little bit, I think there's something wrong with the teaching. One teacher even said, if you're practicing Dharma and it's not fun, then you're not doing it the right way. And so, although there's a lot of seriousness to what Buddha's teaching, obviously, a lot at stake, we have to have humor. So we'll get into that this afternoon. So let's just have a few thoughts of dedication before we leave here, just because it is important anytime that we kind of conclude even a part of a teaching like this, that we have some thoughts of dedication to make sure that we the merits, the positive potential that we've created through being here together with this motivation of bodhicitta, that this is secure in bringing about that result. We talked about this the other night in terms of merits. So just hold that thought now through the force of what we've done here in these last 2 hours, the time we've spent examining these principles that are set out by these 2 great leaders. May we be able to achieve our greatest potential of complete enlightenment and then lead others to that state. May none of what we've done here today be wasted in any way, but only bring forth that most amazing result for ourselves and others. Okay. So we'll resume at 2 o'clock.